I thought my daughter and I were close. I really did. For 28 years, I poured every ounce of love, sacrifice, and devotion into raising Marlo. Her father left when she was just 3 years old, walking out the door one Tuesday morning with nothing but a duffel bag and a note that said he needed to find himself. I never heard from him again. So it became just the two of us against the world, and I promised myself that my little girl would never feel the absence of that man. That she would grow up knowing she was loved beyond measure, that she was my entire universe. I worked 2 jobs for years, waitressing during the day at a diner, where the smell of grease clung to my clothes no matter how many times I washed them, and cleaning office buildings at night when the city went quiet and my feet ached so badly I could barely stand. I did it all without complaint, because every sacrifice felt worth it when I saw her smile. When I watched her graduate high school with honors, when she got accepted into the college of her dreams, I scrimped and saved, going without new clothes for myself, driving a car that broke down more times than I could count, living in a cramped apartment where the heating barely worked in winter, all so she could have opportunities I never had. I was there for every scraped knee, every broken heart, every moment of triumph, and every tear. I thought we had something unbreakable, a bond forged through years of just us two, a connection that nothing could sever. When Marlo met Thaddeus Remington III at a charity gala her company hosted, I was genuinely happy for her. He came from money, old money, the kind that whispers rather than shouts, the kind that owns summer homes in the Hamptons and winter chalets in Aspen. His family had a name that opened doors, a pedigree that stretched back generations, connections that could launch careers with a single phone call. I will admit that when she first brought him home to meet me, I felt a flutter of anxiety in my chest, a worry that I would not measure up, that my modest apartment with its second-hand furniture and faded curtains would somehow embarrass her. But Thaddeus had been polite, almost charming in a rehearsed way, complimenting the dinner I had made even though I could see in his eyes that he was accustomed to much finer cuisine. Marlo seemed happy, her face glowing with that particular light that comes with new love, and I told myself that was all that mattered. Over the next 2 years, I watched as she slowly began to change, subtle shifts that I tried to convince myself were just natural growth, the evolution that comes with becoming part of someone else's world. She started correcting the way I pronounced certain words, gently at first, then with increasing impatience. She stopped inviting me to events with Thaddeus and his family, making excuses about the venues being too formal or the guest lists being restricted. When I would call to chat like we used to, late at night when I got home from work, she would cut conversations short, saying she had an early morning or that Thaddeus was waiting for her. The engagement came as no surprise. Thaddeus proposed at some exclusive restaurant I had never heard of, with a ring that probably cost more than I had earned in 5 years. Marlo called me immediately after, her voice breathless with excitement, and I cried tears of joy for her, genuine happiness mixed with a bittersweet ache that my little girl was entering a new chapter of her life. The wedding planning began almost instantly, and at first, Marlo would come over with bridal magazines and fabric samples, asking my opinion on flowers and color schemes. I treasured those moments, feeling like we were reconnecting, like maybe the distance that had grown between us was just temporary, a phase that would pass. But gradually, those visits became less frequent. Marlo started mentioning Thaddeus's mother, Cordelia, more and more, telling me how Cordelia had introduced her to the best wedding planner in the city, how Cordelia knew all the right vendors, how Cordelia had such impeccable taste. I swallowed my hurt and told myself to be grateful that Marlo had another woman in her life who cared about making her day special, even as a small voice inside me whispered that I was being replaced. 3 months before the wedding, Marlo invited me to lunch at a trendy bistro in a neighborhood I rarely visited, the kind of place where a salad cost more than an entire meal should. She looked beautiful, polished in a way that made her seem like a stranger. Her hair styled perfectly, her clothes expensive and tailored, her makeup applied with professional precision. We made small talk for a while, dancing around the real reason she had asked me there, both of us sensing that something heavy hung in the air between us. Finally, as the waiter cleared our plates, Marlo reached across the table and took my hand, and I felt my heart constrict because I knew from her expression that whatever she was about to say would hurt. She began carefully, her words chosen with deliberate precision, explaining that she and Thaddeus had been discussing the wedding, that his family had certain expectations, that there were traditions and social considerations that needed to be respected. I nodded along, not understanding yet where this was going, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in my stomach. Then she said it, the words that would shatter something fundamental between us. She told me that Cordelia would be walking her down the aisle. I must have misheard, I thought, because surely my own daughter would want her mother, the woman who had raised her single-handedly, who had sacrificed everything for her, to have that honor. But Marlo continued, her voice steady but her eyes not quite meeting mine, explaining that Cordelia had essentially become her second mother, that she had been so instrumental in helping her navigate society, that it would mean so much to the Remington family, that I had to understand this was about more than just the wedding. It was about her future, about the life she was building with Thaddeus. The restaurant suddenly felt too small, the air too thin, and I struggled to breathe normally. To process what I was hearing, I asked her quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, what role I would have in the ceremony then. Marlo brightened slightly, as if relieved that I had accepted this devastating news so calmly, and told me I would be seated in the front row, that I would be recognized and honored, that everyone would know how important I was to her. I wanted to scream. I wanted to overturn the table, to demand how she could do this to me, to ask what had happened to the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who used to make me Mother's Day cards with glitter and crooked hearts, who used to tell me I was her hero. But I did not. I sat there, frozen, my face a mask of composure, while everything inside me crumbled. I told her I understood, that of course she should do what felt right for her, that I just wanted her to be happy. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I forced it out because some part of me still wanted to be the good mother, the understanding mother, the mother who did not make her daughter's wedding about her own hurt feelings. Marlo looked relieved, squeezing my hand and thanking me for being so reasonable, for not making this difficult. She paid for lunch, another small gesture that somehow felt like an insult. A reminder that she lived in a world now where she could casually spend money on overpriced salads while I still clipped coupons and watched every penny. I drove home in a daze, barely seeing the road, operating on autopilot while my mind reeled. When I got back to my apartment, I closed the door, leaned against it, and finally let myself break down, sobbing so hard that my whole body shook. Grieving not just the loss of walking my daughter down the aisle but the loss of the relationship I thought we had. Over the following weeks, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that this was just wedding stress, that things would go back to normal after the ceremony. But deep down, I knew something had fundamentally changed. Marlo had made a choice, and that choice told me exactly where I stood in her new life. I was being demoted from mother to mere guest. My role reduced to that of an attendee. Someone to be seated and acknowledged but not truly central to the occasion. The wedding invitation arrived in the mail, thick cardstock with gold embossing. The kind of invitation that announced wealth and status before you even opened the envelope. My name was listed simply as guest Isolde Thorne, mother of the bride, as if I were just another person filling a seat. There was no special designation. No indication that I had any particular significance beyond a biological connection. I stared at that invitation for a long time, feeling the weight of what it represented, the finality of my diminished role. That night, I made a decision. If Marlo wanted to treat me like a guest, if she wanted to prioritize her new family and her new life over the woman who had given her everything, then I would give her a wedding gift that matched my status. I would not make a scene. I would not cause drama, but I would make a statement that she would never forget. A quiet demonstration of exactly what her choice meant. I had been saving money for years, a secret fund I had built slowly and painfully. setting aside whatever I could spare from my modest income. It was meant to be a substantial wedding gift for Marlo, enough to help her and Thaddeus with a down payment on a house, or to furnish their new home, or to take an extravagant honeymoon. The account had grown to just over $50,000. A small fortune by my standards, accumulated through countless sacrifices, skipped meals, extra shifts, and saying no to anything remotely indulgent for myself. I had imagined the moment I would give it to her, had pictured her face lighting up with surprise and gratitude, had envisioned her throwing her arms around me and telling me I should not have done so much, that I had already given her everything. That fantasy now felt foolish, a naive dream that belonged to a different reality, one where I was more than just a guest at my own daughter's wedding. Instead, I went to the bank and withdrew the money, closing the account I had spent years building. I took that cash and I did something I had never done in my entire life. I spent it on myself. Every single penny. I booked a luxury cruise that departed the day after the wedding, a month-long journey through the Mediterranean with stops in Greece, Italy, France, and Spain, staying in the finest suite available. I bought myself a completely new wardrobe, expensive clothes that actually fit properly, that made me feel beautiful instead of merely adequate, that were chosen for my own pleasure rather than practicality. I got a makeover at an upscale salon, a full day of being pampered with treatments I had only ever read about in magazines. I purchased first-class plane tickets, made reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants, scheduled private tours and experiences that I had always dreamed of but never imagined I could afford. I spent that money with deliberate intention, making choices that were entirely for me, reclaiming something that I had given up the day Marlo was born, the ability to be selfish, to prioritize my own happiness and desires. For Marlo's wedding gift, I went to a department store and bought a generic card, the kind you find in the discount bin, nothing special or personal. Inside, I wrote a simple message: "Congratulations on your wedding. Since I am attending as a guest rather than as your mother, I have given you what is appropriate for a guest to give." I included a check for $150, the standard amount one might give to an acquaintance or distant relative, the kind of gift that is polite but impersonal, sufficient but not meaningful. I sealed the envelope and set it aside, feeling a grim satisfaction in the symbolism, in the way it perfectly reflected how she had made me feel, reduced and dismissed. My decades of love and sacrifice condensed into a transaction that could fit on a check written in 3 digits. The wedding day arrived, and I dressed carefully in one of my new outfits, an elegant dress in deep sapphire blue that made me feel confident and powerful, rather than like someone's afterthought. I did my own makeup, taking my time, applying it with more skill than usual thanks to the lessons I had learned during my salon makeover. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself, and for the first time in months, I felt a spark of something that was not pain or anger but rather a quiet determination, a sense that I was taking back control of my own narrative. I drove to the venue, an exclusive estate with manicured gardens and a mansion that looked like it belonged in a period drama, the kind of place that existed in a world I had never been part of and never would be. I arrived exactly on time, not early like I might have before, not rushing to help with last-minute details or offering to assist in any way, but simply showing up as a guest would, at the appointed hour. A young woman with a clipboard directed me to my seat in the front row, and I sat down, watching as the venue filled with people I did not know, society types with expensive jewelry and designer clothes, everyone chatting and laughing, comfortable in this environment in a way I never could be. I saw Thaddeus's family across the aisle, Cordelia resplendent in a gown that probably cost more than my car, her husband stoic and distinguished beside her, various relatives and friends, filling the rows around them. No one approached me, no one asked who I was, and I realized with a cold clarity that Marlo had not bothered to integrate me into any of the pre-wedding events, had not introduced me to the important people in her new life, had effectively erased me from the narrative except as a necessary footnote, the biological mother who had to be present for appearance's sake, but who held no real significance. The ceremony began, and I watched as the bridesmaids walked down the aisle. Women I had never met, friends from Marlowe's new life, each one perfect and polished and belonging in this world in a way I never could. Then came the moment, the music swelling as everyone stood and turned toward the back of the venue. Marlowe appeared, breathtaking in a wedding gown that probably cost as much as a year of my salary, her face radiant with joy, and on her arm was Cordelia, elegant and composed, walking my daughter down the aisle toward her future. I stood there watching this scene, feeling like I was observing it from behind glass, separate and distant, not quite part of the moment even though I was physically present. My eyes stung with unshed tears, but I refused to let them fall, refused to show any emotion that might be misconstrued as happiness when what I felt was a grief so profound it seemed to hollow me out from the inside. As they passed my row, Marlowe's eyes met mine for just a second, and I saw something flicker across her face, some emotion I could not quite name, perhaps a moment of doubt or recognition, or discomfort. But then it was gone, and she was smiling again, focused on Thaddeus waiting for her at the altar, on the future she was stepping into, on the life she had chosen that did not really include me in any meaningful way. The ceremony proceeded, the officiant speaking words about love and commitment and family, the irony of which was not lost on me. Marlowe and Thaddeus exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to honor and cherish each other, to build a life together, to blend their families into one. I wondered if Marlowe even thought about me as she said those words, if it occurred to her that she had already decided which family mattered more, which relationships were worth preserving, and which could be relegated to the periphery. The reception was held in a grand ballroom, all crystal chandeliers and white roses and elegance that felt excessive and cold. I found my assigned seat at a table with people I had never met, distant relatives of Thaddeus or family friends, polite strangers who made small talk and then largely ignored me, everyone more interested in the open bar and the orchestra than in the woman sitting quietly among them. I watched Marlowe and Thaddeus dance their first dance, watched as Thaddeus danced with Cordelia while everyone applauded, watched as the evening unfolded around me like I was a spectator rather than someone intimately connected to the bride. The dinner was elaborate, course after course of food I barely tasted, my stomach too knotted with emotion to properly eat. I drank champagne, more than I normally would, letting the bubbles create a pleasant numbness that made everything feel slightly less real, slightly more bearable. Eventually, the moment came for gifts to be presented. There was an elaborate table set up, already overflowing with elegantly wrapped packages, envelopes tucked into an ornate box designed specifically for cards. I watched as guests approached Marlowe and Thaddeus, offering congratulations and well wishes, handing over their offerings. When there was a lull, I stood up, smoothed my dress, and walked over to where my daughter stood laughing with a group of Thaddeus's college friends. I waited for her to notice me, and when she finally did, her smile faltered just slightly, a barely perceptible shift that told me she was not entirely comfortable with my presence. I extended the envelope toward her, keeping my expression neutral, pleasant even. The perfect mask of a gracious guest. Marlowe took it, thanking me with a brightness that seemed forced. And I saw her fingers brush over the envelope, likely feeling how thin it was compared to some of the bulging envelopes already in the collection box. I leaned in close, so only she could hear, and I said very quietly, with no anger or bitterness in my tone, just a matter-of-fact statement, since you invited me as a guest rather than as your mother, I gave you a gift appropriate for a guest. I hope you and Thaddeus enjoy it. Then I pulled back, smiled at her, and walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing there with the envelope in her hand and a dawning realization beginning to show on her face. I did not wait to see her open it, did not stick around to witness whatever reaction might come. Instead, I gathered my purse, slipped out of the reception, and drove home, leaving the wedding early, like any guest might, who had fulfilled their social obligation and had no deeper reason to stay. Back in my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the silence, feeling simultaneously empty and liberated, grieving and relieved. The next morning, my phone began ringing before I was fully awake, Marlowe's name flashing on the screen again and again. I let it go to voicemail, listening later to her increasingly frantic messages. The first one started calm, asking me to call her back, saying she needed to talk to me about the gift. The second one was more agitated, asking me if there had been some mistake, if perhaps I had given her the wrong envelope. By the third message, I could hear tears in her voice, a rawness that might have once moved me to immediate action but now just felt like too little too late. She said she had opened all the gifts that morning with Thaddeus, that they had been excitedly going through cards and envelopes, thanking people mentally for their generosity, until they got to mine. She said she had stared at that check for a long time, reading and rereading my message, and that it had hit her like a physical blow what I was really saying, what I was really giving her. She came to my apartment that afternoon, still in casual clothes from the morning after her wedding, her hair pulled back, her face bare of makeup, looking more like the Marlowe I remembered from years ago than the polished society woman she had become. When I opened the door, she was crying, mascara-streaked tears running down her cheeks, her breathing hitched and uneven. She tried to hug me, but I stepped back, keeping physical distance, not ready to offer comfort or reconciliation just because she was upset. We sat in my small living room, the same room where I had raised her, where we had spent countless hours together when it was just us against the world, and now it felt like we were strangers meeting in a familiar space. The history around us, but the connection severed. Marlowe kept apologizing, saying she did not realize, that she had not thought it through, that she had been so caught up in trying to fit into Thaddeus's world, that she had forgotten what really mattered. She said Cordelia had been pushing her, making suggestions that felt like requirements, and that she had been too weak to stand up for what she really wanted, too afraid of not measuring up to the Remington standards, too desperate to be accepted into a world that had always seemed beyond her reach. I listened without interrupting, letting her pour out all her regrets and justifications. But I did not offer easy absolution. When she finally stopped talking, looking at me with desperate pleading eyes, I spoke calmly and clearly. I told her that for 28 years, I had been her mother in every way that mattered, that I had sacrificed things she would never fully understand, that I had built my entire life around making sure she had opportunities and love and support. I told her that when she chose to have Cordelia walk her down the aisle, when she reduced me to just another guest at her wedding, she had sent me a clear message about my value in her life, about whether all those years of sacrifice actually meant anything to her. I told her that my wedding gift had been a mirror, reflecting back exactly how she had treated me, showing her in concrete terms what it felt like to be considered peripheral, to be given the minimum acceptable acknowledgement, to be rendered invisible despite being present. I told her that I had taken the money I had been saving for her, money that represented years of my life and work and sacrifice, and I had spent it on myself, on experiences and joy and pleasure, because if she was going to treat me like a guest, then I was going to treat myself like I mattered. Marlowe looked stricken, her face crumpling as the full weight of what she had done settled over her. She said she would do anything to fix this, that she would tell everyone what a mistake she had made, that she would make it up to me somehow. But I shook my head, feeling sad but also strangely free. I told her that some things cannot be fixed with apologies, that some wounds do not heal just because someone realizes they hurt you, that she had made choices that revealed something fundamental about what she valued, and that I had finally accepted that truth. I told her about the cruise I was leaving for the next day, about how I was going to spend a month discovering who I was when I was not defined solely by being her mother, about how I was reclaiming parts of myself that I had set aside when she was born. I told her that maybe, after I came back, after we both had time to process what had happened, we could try to rebuild something, but that it would never be what it was before, because that relationship had been built on assumptions and expectations that she had shattered. She left eventually, still crying, clutching the check I refused to take back, and I watched her walk to her car, watched her sit there for a long time before starting the engine, and I felt a complex mixture of love and disappointment and grief and relief. That night, I finished packing for my trip, carefully folding my new clothes, organizing my travel documents, feeling an anticipation that had nothing to do with anyone else and everything to do with myself. The next morning, I boarded a plane to Europe, settling into my first-class seat with a glass of champagne, looking out the window as we lifted off, leaving behind everything familiar and flying toward something entirely my own. During that month abroad, I discovered parts of myself I had forgotten existed. I wandered through ancient ruins in Greece, feeling the weight of history and perspective. I ate pasta in small Italian villages where no one knew me or my story. I stood before masterpieces in Paris museums, crying at their beauty without anyone asking me why. I learned that I liked my own company, that I had thoughts and interests and desires that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother, that I was a complete person separate from that role. I met other travelers, mostly women around my age, and heard their stories of reinvention and rediscovery, and I felt less alone in my journey. I sent Marlo a few brief texts letting her know I was alive and well, but I did not engage in long conversations or processing, keeping my attention focused on my own experience rather than managing hers. When I returned home, tanned and rested and fundamentally changed in ways I was still discovering, there was a letter waiting for me from Marlo. It was handwritten, pages and pages of her trying to articulate what she had learned in my absence, how my gift had forced her to confront truths about herself she had been avoiding, how she had been so desperate to escape the limitations of our modest life that she had abandoned the person who had made any escape possible, how she had confused material success with actual worth, how she had let Cordelia and the Remingtons make her ashamed of where she came from and who had raised her. She wrote about conversations she had finally had with Thaddeus, about how she had been honest with him for the first time about her fears of not being good enough for his world, and how he had been surprisingly understanding, admitting that his family could be snobbish and exclusionary, that he loved her for who she was, not who she was trying to become to please them. She wrote that she had started therapy, that she was trying to understand why she had been so willing to betray her values and her relationships for acceptance, that she wanted to become someone worthy of the mother who had raised her. She ended the letter by saying she did not expect forgiveness, that she understood if I needed more time or distance, but that she hoped someday I might let her try to earn back a place in my life, not as the center of it, but as someone who understood now. That love required more than just words. It required actions that demonstrated true value and respect. I read that letter multiple times, sitting in my apartment surrounded by photographs from my trip, evidence of a life I had lived entirely for myself. I felt the pull of old patterns, the instinct to immediately reach out and repair, to make everything okay, because that was what mothers do. But I resisted, recognizing that this time, the healing could not come from me rushing in to fix things. If Marlo truly understood what she had done, if she truly wanted to rebuild our relationship, then she needed to do the work, not just of apologizing but of demonstrating over time that she had internalized the lesson, that she had genuinely changed. Over the following months, Marlo showed up in small, consistent ways. She called regularly, not with demands or drama, but just to check in, to share parts of her day, to ask about mine. She invited me to dinner at her new home, just the two of us, cooking a meal herself rather than having it catered, sitting across from me at a table, without the buffer of Thaddeus or his family, or any distractions, just two women trying to figure out how to relate to each other honestly. She made efforts to include me in her life in ways that felt genuine rather than obligatory, asking my advice not because she had to but because she valued my perspective, sharing vulnerabilities and fears instead of just the polished surface she presented to the rest of the world. Slowly, carefully, something new began to grow between us, not the same as what we had before, but perhaps more authentic. built on a foundation of honest confrontation and real consequences rather than unexamined assumptions and unspoken resentments. I learned to set boundaries, to say no when something did not feel right, to prioritize my own well-being alongside my love for my daughter. Marlo learned that relationships require active maintenance and conscious choice, that you cannot take people for granted just because they have always been there, that real love means seeing people for who they are and valuing them accordingly. The hurt of what happened at the wedding never fully disappeared, but it became part of our story, a painful chapter that taught us both essential truths about worth and sacrifice and the difference between obligation and genuine connection. Now, a year later, Marlo is pregnant with her first child, my first grandchild, and when she told me, she cried and said she finally understood in a new way what I must have felt for her all those years, the fierce protective love that makes you willing to sacrifice anything, the deep connection that makes someone else's well-being more important than your own comfort. She said she could not imagine anyone other than me being beside her when the baby was born, that she wanted me to be the first one to hold her child, that she was going to make sure this baby knew exactly who I was and what I meant to their family. I do not know if every wound can fully heal, if we can ever completely recover what was broken that day when she walked down the aisle on Cordelia's arm instead of mine. But I know that we are trying, that we are both different people than we were, that sometimes the most powerful gift you can give someone is a clear reflection of how their actions make you feel. Even when that gift hurts, even when it costs you something precious, even when it risks everything you thought you could not live without. So yes, my daughter called me a guest at her wedding, and I gave her a gift she will never forget. Not because I wanted to punish her, though I will not pretend there was not some satisfaction in making my point so clearly, but because sometimes love means refusing to accept less than what you deserve. Sometimes it means showing someone that their choices have real consequences. Sometimes it means stepping back and letting them feel the full weight of what they have done so they can truly understand and truly change. My gift was not just that check and that card and that message. My gift was the truth, delivered with clarity and without apology, wrapped in my absence and my own reclaimed life. And maybe, just maybe, that was the gift she needed most, the one that forced her to grow up in a way that all my years of sacrifice never could. The one that taught her that you cannot reduce people who love you to supporting characters in your own story without paying a price. The one that showed her that mothers are human too, with limits and feelings and the right to be valued beyond their utility. That cruise I took, that month I spent learning to be myself again, those experiences that were entirely mine. They gave me something back that I had lost along the way. A sense of my own worth, independent of anyone else. A recognition that I deserved to take up space and have desires and live a life that was not defined solely by what I could do for someone else. And now, when Marlo looks at me, I see respect alongside the love, understanding alongside the affection, a recognition that I am a full person with my own needs and my own value, not just a role to be filled or a resource to be tapped. That shift, that fundamental change in how she sees me and how I allow myself to be seen, that is worth more than any wedding moment could have been, worth more than walking her down any aisle, because it is real and earned and built on truth rather than obligation or guilt or unexamined habit. So if you are out there watching this, wherever you are in the world, and you have ever felt taken for granted, ever felt reduced to a role rather than recognized as a person, ever felt like your sacrifices were invisible, or your love was assumed rather than appreciated, I want you to know that you have the right to step back, to reclaim your own life, to set boundaries even with people you love desperately, to demand that your value be acknowledged not just in words but in actions. It is not selfish to expect reciprocity. It is not wrong to want to be seen and honored. It is not cruel to let people experience the consequences of treating you as less than you are. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's hurtful behavior. Even when that refusal costs you something precious, even when it means enduring pain and loss and uncertainty, because real growth often comes through Discomfort and real change often requires crisis. If this story resonated with you, if you felt something in my words, I would love to know where you are listening from, what part of the world you are in, whether my experience echoes something in your own life. Please leave a like if this moved you. Subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Stories of real people navigating the complex terrain of love and family and sacrifice and boundaries. Stories that do not always have neat, happy endings but that honor the messy truth of human relationships. Thank you for listening to my story, for sitting with me through this difficult memory, for understanding that sometimes the gifts we give are not the ones that come wrapped in pretty paper, but the ones that carry hard truths and painful lessons and the possibility of genuine transformation.